The unspoken woods. I'm a ranger, there's something in the woods we're not allowed to talk about, and I've kept that secret for 15 years until today when I found Sarah Chen's body arranged in the same ceremonial pattern as the others, her park ranger uniform still pristine except for the symbols carved into her exposed skin, and I realized that staying silent wasn't protecting anyone anymore. It was just feeding whatever lurks in the deepest part of the Blackwood National Forest. The call came in at dawn, hikers reporting what they thought was a mannequin positioned off the Crow's Nest Trail, and I knew before I even arrived what I would find because the location was too specific, too deliberate, falling exactly on the intersection of the ley lines that we pretend don't exist, that aren't marked on any official map but are burned into the memory of every ranger who's worked here long enough to know the real rules. Sarah had been on the job for only 6 months, bright and eager and full of questions that the rest of us had learned not to ask, and I remembered the day she'd noticed the inconsistencies in the trail reports, the way certain areas were marked as closed for maintenance that never happened, the gaps in the patrol schedules that didn't make sense until you realized they were designed to keep us away from specific coordinates at specific times. Chief Ranger Morrison was already at the scene when I arrived, his face wearing the same expression I'd seen 3 times before, a mixture of resignation and fear that he tried to hide behind professional detachment, and he pulled me aside before I could approach the body, reminding me of the protocols we'd all signed, the NDAs that went deeper than simple employment agreements, the promises we'd made to agencies that didn't officially exist. The arrangement of Sarah's body was precise, mathematical in its positioning, her arms and legs forming angles that corresponded to constellations that wouldn't be visible for another 3 months, her fingers pointing to true north and true south simultaneously, which should have been impossible, and the symbols carved into her skin were from a language that predated any known human civilization in North America, though we weren't supposed to know that either. I'd seen this exact scene before with Ranger Douglas in 2018, with Ranger Patel in 2014, and with Ranger Williams in 2010, each time in a different location but always at those same coordinate intersections, always with the same impossible precision, always with those symbols that hurt to look at directly and seemed to shift when you tried to photograph them, though the official reports would list the causes of death as animal attacks or accidents. Morrison handed me the standard forms, the ones that would describe this as a tragic encounter with a bear or a fall from the trail, and I could see his hands shaking as he went through the motions we'd performed before, the careful choreography of covering up something that the public couldn't know about, that would cause panic if revealed, that would force us to acknowledge that Blackwood National Forest contained something ancient and hungry and bound by rules we only partially understood. The other rangers arrived in shifts, the newer ones shocked and asking questions, the veterans silent and efficient as they began the process of documentation that would be filed in locked cabinets and never digitized, never uploaded to any system that could be hacked or leaked, because the agreements we'd signed were clear about the consequences of unauthorized disclosure, and we'd all heard stories about rangers who tried to tell the truth and simply disappeared. I remembered my first encounter with the thing we don't name, back in 2008 when I was fresh out of training and assigned to solo patrol in Section 7, how I'd heard the sound that wasn't quite human but wasn't quite animal either, how I'd seen the trees bend in ways that defied physics to create a path that led to a clearing that didn't exist on any map, where standing stones older than the mountains themselves formed a perfect circle that hummed with subsonic frequencies. That night I'd followed protocol without understanding it, retreating along the exact path I'd come, not looking back no matter what sounds followed me, reporting to Morrison who'd sat me down and explained the real job of a Blackwood Ranger, how we weren't just protecting the forest from people or people from the forest, but maintaining a balance that had been negotiated long before the Park Service existed, before the government existed, before written history existed. The truth that we carried was weight enough to break most people, the knowledge that the national park system wasn't created just for conservation or recreation but as a containment network, that certain locations across the country were designated as parks specifically because they needed constant monitoring, needed rangers who could enforce boundaries that weren't about trail safety or wildlife protection but about keeping ancient things asleep or at least contained. Sarah's body had to be removed according to specific protocols, wrapped in materials that had been blessed or cursed depending on your perspective by representatives of indigenous tribes whose names weren't recorded anywhere, whose existence was officially denied but who showed up when needed, speaking languages that predated the ones they taught in schools, performing rituals that looked like nonsense but were the only thing that kept the forest from claiming more than its agreed-upon share. I watched as they prepared her, noting how the symbols on her skin seemed to fade as the sun climbed higher, how the impossible angles of her limbs slowly relaxed into normal human positions, how the clearing itself began to look more ordinary as if reality was reasserting itself now that the ceremony or feeding or whatever we were supposed to call it was complete, and I made the same notes I'd made before, using the coded language we developed to describe the undescribable. The hardest part was always the family notification, sitting across from parents or spouses or siblings and lying about how their loved one died, watching them grieve for a fiction while knowing that the truth would be worse, that telling them their daughter or husband or sister had been taken by something that predated human understanding of the world would only add madness to their grief. So we stuck to the scripts about accidents and animal attacks and acts of God. Morrison called a meeting that night in a conference room that didn't appear on any building schematic, the one you could only find if you'd been shown the way, where the walls were lined with maps that showed the real boundaries of the park, the zones marked in red where no human was allowed to go, the intersection points where we'd lost rangers over the decades, the patterns that emerged if you stared long enough but that would give you migraines if you stared too long. The assembled rangers were the core group, the ones who'd been here long enough to know the truth, and we went through the familiar ritual of updating our records, adding Sarah's name to the list that went back to 1946 when the park was established, though the indigenous representatives had shown us older lists, records kept in forms we didn't understand that suggested the sacrifices went back millennia, that we were just the latest in a long line of guardians who fed the forest to keep it contained. Deputy Chief Rawlings presented the schedule adjustments, the careful dance of patrol routes that would ensure no ranger was in the wrong place at the wrong time, the mathematical precision required to maintain coverage while respecting the boundaries we'd learned through trial and fatal error, and I noticed how he avoided looking at the spot where Sarah used to sit, how we all did, as if acknowledging her absence would make it too real. The meeting concluded with the usual reminders about operational security, about the monitoring systems that tracked our communications, our internet usage, our movements both in and out of the park, about the consequences for breaking the silence that protected not just the secret but supposedly the world from what would happen if the containment failed, if the things in the woods were allowed to spread beyond the boundaries we maintained. I returned to my cabin that night thinking about Sarah's questions, how she'd noticed the patterns in the missing hiker reports, how certain people who entered the park were never investigated when they didn't come out, how the demographics of the missing followed specific criteria that suggested selection rather than random chance, and how I'd deflected her concerns with the same lies I'd been told when I was new, the same misdirection that kept rangers focused on the mundane dangers while the real threat operated according to its own ancient logic. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of the forest moving, of trees that walked and paths that changed and clearings that existed outside normal space, and I woke to find my windows covered in symbols drawn in condensation that matched the ones on Sarah's body, a warning or a marking that meant I'd been noticed, that my presence at the scene had registered with whatever intelligence guided these things, and I spent the pre-dawn hours washing them away with solutions Morrison had taught me to make. The next weeks followed established patterns, the investigation that wasn't really an investigation, the reports filed in triplicate with different versions for different agencies, the grief counseling sessions that doubled as monitoring to ensure no one was breaking under the strain of keeping the secret, and through it all the forest waited and watched, and we could feel its attention like a physical weight whenever we ventured too close to the forbidden zones. I partnered with Jake Thornton for patrols, a 10-year veteran who'd seen 2 of the previous incidents, and we developed the wordless communication that came from shared knowledge of horrors, the ability to know when to turn back from a trail without discussing why, when to radio false positions to avoid being sent to coordinates that felt wrong, when to ignore sounds that seemed to be calling our names in voices that almost but not quite belonged to people we knew. Jake told me about the time before GPS, when rangers had to rely on compass and instinct, how the magnetic fields in certain parts of the park would cause needles to spin wildly or point to directions that didn't exist, how they'd learn to navigate by other signs, by the way certain birds would never fly over specific areas, by the temperature drops that had nothing to do with elevation or weather, by the feeling in your gut that said turn back now or become another name on the list. The indigenous representatives came monthly, always at night, always unannounced but somehow expected, and they would walk the boundaries performing maintenance on things that looked like random rock formations or fallen trees but were actually markers, containment points, warnings, or appeasements depending on who you asked, and we were instructed to give them space, to not watch directly, to not ask questions about the songs they sang in languages that predated human speech. One night I followed them at a distance, breaking protocol out of a need to understand what we were really protecting or protecting against, and I watched them stop at a clearing where the moonlight revealed patterns in the earth that couldn't be natural, geometric designs that hurt to perceive directly, and they performed a ritual that involved movements that human joints shouldn't be able to make, creating shadows that didn't match their bodies, opening something that looked like a door in the air itself. Through that door I saw the truth we were hired to hide, the vast intelligence that moved through the forest like blood through veins, the entity or entities that existed partially in our world and partially somewhere else, the things that had been here before the mountains rose and would be here after they crumbled, that had agreed to limitations in exchange for payments we didn't fully understand but faithfully delivered in the form of missing hikers and occasional rangers who knew too much. The representatives noticed me watching, and one of them, an old woman whose eyes held depths that seemed geological in age, approached and spoke in English for the first time I'd ever heard, telling me that curiosity would kill more than cats in Blackwood, that the arrangements existed for reasons beyond human comprehension, that what seemed like horror to us was actually mercy compared to what would happen if the boundaries failed, if the old agreements were broken, if the things in the woods were allowed to remember what they had been before they were contained. She showed me scars on her arms that matched the symbols we found on victims, explaining that her family had been guardians for generations uncounted, that the knowledge was passed down through bloodlines that predated any government or nation, that they worked with us not for us, maintaining a balance that kept the world turning in ways we couldn't understand, and that every person who entered these woods and never left had served a purpose in that balance whether they knew it or not. The conversation left me shaken, questioning everything about my role as a ranger, about the ethics of keeping such secrets, about the morality of allowing people to disappear to feed something ancient and hungry, but when I tried to discuss it with Morrison he reminded me of the satellite images from 1987 when a ranger had tried to expose the truth, how the forest had expanded 17 miles in a single night, swallowing 3 towns before the containment was re-established, how the official story of a wildfire had required the kind of cover-up that made conspiracy theorists look unimaginative. I began my own research, careful to avoid digital trails, using the old paper records stored in the basement archives that smelled of mold and something else, something organic and wrong, and I found patterns within patterns, cycles of activity that corresponded to astronomical events not tracked by modern science, names of rangers going back decades who'd asked the same questions I was asking, who'd tried to find answers and either disappeared or learned to live with the uncertainty. The forest itself seemed to respond to my investigation, with trails I'd walked hundreds of times suddenly leading to new places, markers I'd used for navigation shifting when I wasn't looking, and sounds in the night that mimicked human speech but weren't quite right, like something vast and inhuman trying to communicate using tools it didn't fully understand. And I realized that the thing we protected against was also aware of us, studied us the way we studied it, and maybe had its own protocols for dealing with rangers who knew too much. Sarah's replacement arrived 6 months after her death, a eager young man named Tom Rodriguez who reminded me of myself when I'd started, full of environmental passion and outdoor expertise but completely unprepared for the real job, and I found myself in Morrison's position, having to decide how much truth to reveal, how quickly to indoctrinate him into the conspiracy of silence that kept the forest contained and the world safe from things that shouldn't exist. I took the middle path, letting Tom discover the inconsistencies naturally, being there when he started asking questions about the patrol schedules and the closed areas and the reports that didn't match reality, guiding him toward the truth gradually so the shock wouldn't break him the way it had broken some rangers who learned too much too fast, who couldn't reconcile their rational worldview with the evidence of their senses. The forest tested him early, manifesting phenomena on his 3rd solo patrol that would have sent most people running, paths that led in circles despite GPS showing straight lines, trees that weren't there on previous surveys, sounds that came from everywhere and nowhere, and I monitored his radio calls, listening for the edge of panic that would mean we needed to extract him before he became another casualty of curiosity. But Tom surprised me with his adaptability, reporting the anomalies in the same coded language we all learned to use, accepting the impossible with a pragmatism that suggested he'd already suspected the world contained more than official sources acknowledged, and within a month he was navigating the real job with the kind of instinctive understanding that meant he might survive long enough to train the next generation. The seasonal patterns became more pronounced that year, with incidents clustering around the equinoxes and solstices in ways that made our job harder, more dangerous, and we lost 2 hikers in September despite our best efforts to redirect traffic away from the active zones, their bodies never found but their names added to the ledger that someone somewhere maintained, balancing accounts we weren't privileged to see. October brought the worst incident in my tenure, a family of 4 who'd ignored multiple warnings and barriers to camp in Section 9, in the heart of what we called the hunger zone, and when we found their tent it was pristine, sleeping bags still warm, food half-eaten, but no trace of the people except for shadows burned into the ground in positions that suggested they'd been running when they were taken, converted, absorbed, or whatever term failed to capture what really happened when the forest claimed its due. The cover-up required resources beyond our usual protocols, bringing in federal agencies that didn't officially exist, people with clearances that meant they could rewrite reality at least on paper, and they constructed a story about a gas leak from an old mining operation, complete with documentation going back decades, environmental reports that explained everything except what really happened, and the public believed it because the alternative was impossible. Morrison announced his retirement that winter, 30 years of keeping secrets having worn him down to a ghost of himself, and he pulled me aside on his last day to hand over the real files, the ones that contained contacts for the indigenous guardians, the true maps of the forest, the protocols written in multiple languages including some that predated known human writing, and the burden of knowledge that came with being the one who decided who lived and who fed the forest. My promotion to Chief Ranger came with access to the deepest secrets, the satellite surveillance that showed the forest breathing, expanding and contracting in patterns that matched no known biological process, the seismic data that revealed structures underground that couldn't be natural but predated human presence by millions of years, the radiation readings that spiked in ways that physics couldn't explain but that correlated with the disappearances. I learned about the other forests, the network of parks and reserves around the world that served the same function as Blackwood, containing things that couldn't be allowed to roam free, and the informal communication between ranger services that shared information in codes and ciphers, warning each other about active periods, sharing what little knowledge we'd accumulated about the things we guarded against, comparing notes on what worked and what led to disasters. The weight of leadership meant making decisions about who to recruit and who to let go, who could handle the truth and who would break under it, and I found myself evaluating new rangers not just on their wilderness skills or physical fitness but on their ability to accept the impossible, to maintain necessary silences, to understand that sometimes the greatest service to humanity was to stand guard over horrors that must never be revealed. Tom became my most trusted deputy, showing the same progression I'd experienced from shock to acceptance to determination, and together we refined the protocols, updated the maps with new danger zones as the forest's appetite seemed to grow, modified patrol schedules to account for lunar cycles and magnetic fluctuations and the migration patterns of things that weren't quite animals but moved through the woods like predators. We lost another ranger in the spring, Maria Gonzalez, who'd been with us 8 years and should have known better than to investigate the lights in Section 12, but the forest had ways of calling to people, of making them forget their training, of luring them into situations where all their experience meant nothing, and we found her 3 days later in the same ceremonial position, the same symbols, the same impossible angles that hurt to perceive. The indigenous guardians increased their visits, performing more frequent rituals, and the old woman who'd spoken to me years before warned that the boundaries were weakening, that the agreed-upon payments weren't sufficient anymore, that the thing in the forest was growing restless, testing its chains, remembering what it had been before humans had learned the words to bind it, and that we needed to prepare for the possibility that our containment might fail. That summer brought record numbers of visitors to the park, people seeking outdoor escapes unaware they were walking through a prison for something that viewed them as food or worse, and we struggled to maintain safety without revealing why certain areas were truly off-limits, using mundane excuses like trail maintenance and wildlife protection to mask the real dangers, watching the statistics and praying the forest would be satisfied with the offerings that inevitably occurred. The mathematics of survival became brutal calculus, accepting that a certain number of disappearances were inevitable, that our job wasn't to save everyone but to maintain the minimum losses that kept the forest contained, and every missing hiker report became a moral weight, knowing we could prevent some deaths by telling the truth but that doing so would potentially doom millions if the containment failed. I started documenting everything in hidden caches, creating records that might survive if the worst happened, if the forest finally broke free of whatever held it back, hoping future survivors might find them and understand what we tried to do, why we'd kept silent, why we'd allowed people to die rather than risk the greater catastrophe of full disclosure and the panic that would follow. The other rangers noticed my preparations but said nothing, understanding that we all dealt with the knowledge in our own ways, some through denial, some through faith in the system, some through the kind of gallows humor that made light of cosmic horror because the alternative was madness, and we supported each other as best we could while maintaining the professional distance that came from knowing any of us might be next. Autumn arrived with unusual phenomena, aurora borealis appearing at latitudes where it shouldn't exist, electromagnetic interference that killed electronics within a 5-mile radius of certain coordinates, and temperature variations that created microclimates where snow fell in September next to areas that remained summer warm. All signs that the boundaries between our world and wherever the forest entity originated were becoming dangerously thin. The decision to close entire sections of the park brought scrutiny from above, politicians and bureaucrats who didn't have clearance to know the truth demanding explanations for the lost revenue, the negative publicity, the conspiracy theories that flourished online despite our best efforts to suppress them, and I found myself in conference calls with people whose ignorance was both a blessing and a danger, trying to balance disclosure with security. Tom suggested we needed more radical solutions, that the old protocols were failing because the entity was evolving, adapting to our containment methods the way a virus adapts to antibiotics, and he proposed expeditions into the forbidden zones to gather intelligence, to understand our enemy better, arguing that ignorance was no longer protective but actively dangerous as the situation deteriorated. I authorized limited reconnaissance, sending teams with specific protocols for retreat, with dead man switches that would alert us if they were compromised, with psychological evaluations before and after to ensure they hadn't been affected by exposure to whatever emanated from the deep woods, and what they brought back challenged every assumption we'd operated under for decades. The photos showed structures that couldn't exist, architecture that predated human civilization by eons but incorporated principles we hadn't discovered yet, suggesting either time didn't flow linearly in the deep forest or that something had been manipulating our development from the beginning, guiding us toward some purpose we couldn't fathom. And the implications made the simple horror of a hungry forest seem almost comforting by comparison. Audio recordings captured sounds that linguistic experts couldn't identify as any known language but that pattern analysis suggested contained meaning, possibly communications between entities or components of a single vast intelligence that used the forest as a physical manifestation, and some rangers reported understanding fragments despite not recognizing the words, as if the meaning bypassed normal cognition and spoke directly to some older part of the brain. The samples of soil and plant matter revealed DNA that shouldn't exist, combinations of genetic material that suggested either contamination from somewhere else or evolution along paths that terrestrial life had never taken, and the lab that analyzed them shut down their research after 3 technicians experienced psychological breaks, claiming they could feel the samples watching them, thinking at them, trying to change them from the inside out. Winter brought a brief respite, the cold seeming to slow whatever process was accelerating, but we knew it was temporary, that spring would bring new challenges, new growth, new hunger from the thing we guarded against, and we used the time to reinforce protocols, to train new rangers in the reality of their job, to prepare for possibilities we couldn't fully imagine but knew were coming. The indigenous guardians held a gathering, representatives from tribes across the continent whose names weren't in any history book, whose existence was officially denied but whose knowledge predated European contact by millennia, and they shared prophecies that suggested we were approaching a crucial period, a time when the old agreements would be tested, when the boundaries might fail entirely unless new arrangements were made. They spoke of cycles within cycles, of previous civilizations that had faced the same challenge and failed, leaving only ruins that archaeologists misinterpret, of the possibility that humanity itself was just another experiment by the intelligence in the forest, another attempt to create guardians who could maintain the balance, and that our success or failure would determine whether the experiment continued or was terminated. The revelation that we might not be protecting the world from the forest but were instead being tested by it, that our role as rangers might be part of some incomprehensible selection process, changed the context of everything we did, every decision we made, every life we failed to save, and the weight of that possibility made the already difficult job almost unbearable for those who thought too deeply about it. Spring arrived with violence, the forest awakening with hunger that the winter hadn't satisfied, and we lost 6 hikers in the first week despite our best efforts, their bodies found in arrangements that suggested not just feeding but communication, messages spelled out in corpses that we photographed and analyzed and tried to understand, patterns that hurt to look at but might contain the key to negotiation or survival. The public pressure became intense, families demanding answers, media investigating the statistical anomalies of Blackwood's missing persons rate, conspiracy theorists getting dangerously close to the truth, and we found ourselves fighting a war on 2 fronts, against the forest entity and against disclosure, knowing that either could end the world as we knew it just in different ways. A breakthrough came from Tom's analysis of the patterns, recognizing that the arrangements weren't random but followed mathematical principles that connected to theoretical physics, to dimensions beyond the standard 4, to the possibility that what we called the forest entity existed partially in spaces human perception couldn't access directly but could infer through the shadows it cast in our reality. This understanding led to new protocols, ways of predicting where and when the entity would manifest, what triggered its hunger, how to minimize losses while maintaining the containment, and for a brief period we thought we'd gained the upper hand, that science and observation could tame even cosmic horror, but we were wrong in ways that would cost us dearly. The summer solstice brought the worst incident in the park's recorded history, an entire tour group of 30 people vanishing between 2 checkpoints, leaving behind only their vehicles and personal effects arranged in patterns that matched constellation maps of distant galaxies, suggesting either the entity's reach extended beyond Earth or that Earth itself was just one node in a vast network we couldn't comprehend. The cover-up required resources that strained even the shadow agencies that supported us, creating false identities and travel records and reasons why 30 people would simultaneously abandon their lives, and the psychological toll on those of us who knew the truth was severe, leading to resignations, breakdowns, and 2 suicides among the ranger staff who couldn't reconcile their role in allowing such losses. I found myself questioning everything, whether the containment was worth the cost, whether we were protecting humanity or just prolonging its servitude to something that saw us as cattle at best and lab rats at worst, whether the brave choice would be disclosure and accepting whatever consequences came from humanity learning it wasn't alone or dominant or safe in any meaningful way. The indigenous guardians offered a different perspective, arguing that the arrangement, horrible as it seemed, was the best of bad options, that without the containment protocols the entity wouldn't just feed more freely but would transform the world into something unrecognizable, that the forests were wounds in reality that we kept from festering into something that would consume everything, and that our role, however morally complex, was essential. Fall brought new phenomena, time distortions where rangers would enter the forest and emerge hours later thinking minutes had passed or vice versa, where equipment would age decades and days, where photos would show people who hadn't been there when the picture was taken, all suggesting the boundaries weren't just thinning but becoming permeable in ways that threatened the basic stability of cause and effect. We adapted our training to include protocols for temporal anomalies, teaching rangers to recognize the signs of chronological displacement, to maintain detailed logs that could reveal discrepancies in experienced versus elapsed time, to accept that linear time might be a local phenomenon that the forest entity didn't respect or operate within, adding another layer of complexity to an already impossible job. The decision to recruit from military special operations units brought new capabilities but also new challenges, as soldiers trained for human enemies struggled to accept threats that didn't follow any rules of engagement they understood, that couldn't be defeated with superior firepower or tactical planning, that required a different kind of courage to face the unknowable and undefeatable and still maintain position. Winter's return slowed but didn't stop the escalation, and we used the respite to consolidate our knowledge, creating comprehensive guides for future rangers that documented everything we'd learned about the entity, the patterns, the protocols that worked and those that had failed catastrophically, knowing that our successors would need every advantage as the situation continued to deteriorate. The new year brought authorization for more aggressive containment measures, including the installation of monitoring equipment that operated on principles at the edge of human science, sensors that could detect dimensional fluctuations, cameras that could capture images outside the visible spectrum, audio equipment that could record sounds human ears couldn't process but that might contain crucial intelligence. What we discovered challenged even our expanded understanding, revealing that the forest entity wasn't singular but plural, not one intelligence but an ecosystem of incomprehensible beings that existed partially in our world and partially elsewhere, that competed and cooperated according to rules we couldn't grasp, and that humanity's role in their ecology was both more and less important than we'd imagined. The recordings showed shapes that shouldn't exist, geometries that violated three-dimensional logic, movements that suggested agency and purpose but along vectors human minds couldn't track, and several rangers who spent too long analyzing the data experienced what we came to call dimensional vertigo, a disorientation that persisted even away from the forest, as if exposure to impossible spaces had permanently altered their perception. Spring arrived with what we'd feared, a major breach in Section 7 where reality itself seemed to tear, creating a zone where the forest entity could manifest more directly, where the usual rules didn't apply, where entering meant accepting that you might not come back as the same species you went in, if you came back at all, and we had to establish a perimeter with resources we didn't have for a threat we couldn't fully define. The indigenous guardians performed their most intensive ritual yet, 3 days of ceremonies that required materials and knowledge I couldn't begin to understand, and when they finished the tear had been sutured but not healed, contained but not closed, a wound in the world that we would have to monitor constantly, adjusting our entire operation to accommodate this new vulnerability. Public awareness reached a tipping point when a group of investigative journalists published a series connecting disappearances across multiple national parks, recognizing patterns that suggested coordination, intelligence, purpose behind what authorities insisted were random tragedies, and we found ourselves implementing more aggressive disinformation campaigns, discrediting witnesses, creating false leads, doing things that would have horrified the idealistic ranger I'd been 15 years ago. The moral compromises accumulated like sediment, each justified by the greater good, each necessary to prevent panic or maintain containment, but the weight of them pressed down on all of us, creating a shared complicity that bonded us more than any training or oath, the dark knowledge that we'd chosen to be guardians of a secret that demanded human sacrifice and made us accomplices in cosmic horror. Tom proposed a radical solution: direct communication with the entity using the patterns we'd decoded, the mathematical principles that seemed to govern its manifestations, arguing that if it was intelligent enough to arrange bodies in meaningful ways, to respond to our containment efforts, then perhaps negotiation was possible, perhaps the ancient agreements could be updated for modern realities. The attempt was authorized despite my reservations, using equipment that translated human concepts into the mathematical languages the entity seemed to use, broadcasting into the deep forest proposals for new arrangements, offers of willing volunteers instead of random victims, anything that might reduce the casualties while maintaining the containment, hoping intelligence meant rationality even in beings that existed outside human understanding. The response came not through our equipment but through dreams, every ranger in Blackwood experiencing the same vision simultaneously, a perspective from outside normal space-time that showed Earth as a tiny node in a vast network of connected points, each hosting entities like our forest, each maintained by guardians like us, all part of some incomprehensible purpose that might be cultivation or imprisonment or something that had no human analog. In the dream we saw ourselves as the entity saw us, not as individuals but as components of a system, interchangeable parts maintaining a function we couldn't fully grasp, and the offer was clear even without words: continue the current arrangement or face replacement by guardians who would be less squeamish about the requirements, who would be designed rather than evolved for the role, who would feel no moral conflict about feeding the forest. The collective trauma of that shared vision led to more resignations, rangers who couldn't accept their role in the cosmic machinery, who chose ignorance and exile over continued complicity, and I couldn't blame them even as I stayed, committed to the illusion that human guardianship was better than the alternatives, that our moral struggles meant something even to entities that saw us as insects. Summer brought new challenges, climate change affecting the forest in ways that disrupted the established patterns, creating unpredictability that made our jobs harder and more dangerous, and we realized that human activity was destabilizing more than just the weather, that the delicate balance we maintained was threatened by forces beyond our control, That the entity might use environmental collapse as an excuse to renegotiate terms we couldn't refuse. The park's official closure for undefined maintenance bought us time but also increased scrutiny, conspiracy theories flourishing online despite our suppression efforts, and we found ourselves fighting an information war alongside our physical containment duties, monitoring social media, infiltrating forums, discrediting witnesses who got too close to the truth, becoming the men in black of forest management. A new generation of rangers arrived, recruited from backgrounds that prepared them for unconventional threats, backgrounds in physics and philosophy alongside wilderness survival, people who could accept impossible realities without breaking, who understood that protecting humanity sometimes meant protecting it from itself, from knowledge that would shatter worldviews and sanity alike. Training evolved to include meditation techniques borrowed from traditions that had dealt with incomprehensible forces for millennia, ways to maintain mental stability when confronted with things that violated human understanding, methods for compartmentalizing knowledge that would be corrosive if dwelt upon, creating rangers who were part warrior, part scientist, part mystic, and wholly committed to an impossible task. The forest entity began showing new behaviors, manifestations that suggested not just hunger but curiosity, arrangements of natural materials that mimicked human art, sounds that almost formed words in languages that didn't exist yet, as if it was learning from us even as we studied it, evolving in response to our containment, becoming something new that our protocols might not be able to handle. Fall brought the worst fear realized, evidence that similar entities in other locations were becoming active simultaneously, suggesting coordination across impossible distances, a awakening that threatened not just Blackwood but the entire containment network, and emergency protocols activated worldwide as rangers in a dozen countries faced escalating incidents that pushed resources and sanity to breaking points. The global response required unprecedented cooperation between agencies that officially didn't know about each other, sharing resources and knowledge across borders and classifications, creating a shadow network of guardians united by the terrible knowledge of what lurked in the wild places of the world, what had always been there waiting, watching, hungering for more than flesh. Winter arrived like a mercy, slowing the escalation enough for us to regroup, to share what we'd learned, to update protocols based on hard-won knowledge, and I found myself in secure facilities that didn't exist on any government record, briefing people whose names I would never know about things that couldn't be true but were, creating contingency plans for scenarios that ranged from bad to apocalyptic. The indigenous guardians revealed more of their knowledge, ancient warnings about cycles of activity that suggested we were approaching something their ancestors had faced and barely survived, a testing period where the entities would push boundaries to see if humanity was still worthy of the guardian role or if it was time for the experiment to end and something new to begin. We prepared as best we could for a threat we couldn't fully understand, upgrading equipment, refining protocols, recruiting and training new rangers to replace those we'd lost to death or madness or simple human inability to continue facing the impossible, building a force that might be able to maintain the containment through whatever was coming, though none of us really believed we were ready. Spring returned with fury, the forest exploding with activity that made previous years seem calm, manifestations that challenged not just our containment but our understanding of reality itself, with entire sections of the park shifting between dimensions, existing in multiple states simultaneously, creating paradoxes that hurt to think about and impossible to navigate safely. The casualties mounted despite our preparations, rangers lost not to death but to transformation, returning from patrols changed in ways that medical science couldn't explain, their DNA rewritten, their consciousness expanded or fractured, speaking in languages that predated human speech about concepts that human minds weren't designed to process, and we had to create new protocols for containment of our own people. Tom led a desperate mission into the heart of the anomaly, volunteer rangers equipped with experimental gear that might protect them from the worst effects, and what they found challenged our fundamental assumptions about the entity, discovering not an alien intelligence but something far stranger, a place where consciousness itself had taken physical form, where thought became landscape and emotion became weather. The reports they brought back described cities that existed in spaces between spaces, populated by things that might have been human once or might be what humans were becoming, architecture that grew like living things following patterns that incorporated both organic growth and mathematical precision, suggesting a marriage of nature and intelligence that transcended our binary understanding of either. Communication attempts using the new understanding yielded results that were both promising and terrifying, as the entity responded with increasing sophistication, creating formations in the forest that contained messages we could partially decode, expressing concepts that stretched our comprehension but hinted at purposes beyond simple hunger, at roles we were being groomed to play in dramas that spanned geological time. The summer solstice brought what we'd feared and hoped for in equal measure: direct contact with representatives of the entity that appeared human enough to communicate with but wrong in ways that triggered every instinct to run, beings that wore our shape but moved through dimensions we couldn't perceive, speaking words that carried meaning on levels beyond sound, offering bargains we weren't sure we understood. They called themselves shepherds, though the translation was imperfect, and explained that the forests were nurseries, that Earth was one of many worlds where consciousness was being cultivated, tested, refined for purposes that wouldn't make sense to us for millennia yet, that humanity's role was both guardian and crop, protecting something that would eventually transform us into something else entirely. The revelation that we weren't containing a threat but participating in our own evolution, that the horror and loss were part of some cosmic gardening project, broke several rangers completely, unable to reconcile the deaths they'd witnessed with any benevolent purpose, and I watched good people choose madness over accepting that human suffering was just compost for incomprehensible growth. But others found strange comfort in purpose, even alien purpose, in knowing that the sacrifices meant something beyond random horror, that we were part of something larger even if we couldn't understand it, and the Ranger Corps split between those who saw ourselves as prisoners and those who saw ourselves as participants in something that transcended human moral frameworks. The negotiations that followed were unlike any human diplomacy, conducted in mathematics and music, in arrangements of matter and energy that conveyed meaning through pattern rather than language, and slowly we developed new agreements, new protocols that acknowledged our growing understanding while maintaining the necessary mysteries, balancing revelation with sanity. Fall brought changes to the forest itself, areas that had been forbidden becoming accessible as the entity adjusted its presence, revealing wonders that made the horrors seem almost worthwhile, ecosystems that operated on principles we were only beginning to understand, life forms that existed partially in our reality and partially elsewhere, beauty that required expanded consciousness to perceive. We established new research stations in the transition zones, staffed by rangers who'd been changed enough to survive prolonged exposure, studying the intersection of human and alien, documenting the slow transformation of our species that the forest represented, trying to prepare humanity for changes that were inevitable whether we cooperated or not. The indigenous guardians revealed their final secret, that they weren't fully human anymore, hadn't been for generations, that their role as intermediaries had changed them in ways that prepared them for what was coming, and they offered to teach us their techniques for conscious evolution, for choosing how we changed rather than having change forced upon us. Some rangers accepted the training, undergoing rituals that altered perception permanently, gaining ability to navigate spaces that existed outside normal geometry, to communicate with aspects of the entity directly, becoming bridges between human and other, and I watched them struggle with identities that no longer fit simple categories, neither fully human nor entirely alien. Winter came with revelations about the global situation, other sites reporting similar evolution, similar negotiations, a worldwide transformation beginning in the wild places but inevitably spreading, and we realized our role was changing from containment to management, from preventing to guiding a change that had always been inevitable, that our resistance had just been part of the test. The public disclosure began in controlled ways, careful leaks that prepared portions of the population for larger truths, using fiction and speculation to introduce concepts that would have been rejected as impossible if presented as fact, creating a cultural framework for accepting that humanity wasn't alone, wasn't dominant, wasn't what we thought we were. My own transformation came gradually, exposure to the forest changing me in subtle ways, expanding perception, altering consciousness, until I could walk paths that didn't exist for baseline humans, could understand fragments of the entity's communication directly, could see the patterns underlying reality in ways that made my old worldview seem quaint and limited. Tom underwent more dramatic changes, volunteering for deep exposure that rebuilt him from the cellular level up, returning from a month in the deep forest with abilities that shouldn't exist, knowledge that predated human civilization, and eyes that saw spectrums beyond light, becoming something that was still Tom but also more, a preview of humanity's potential future. The Ranger Corps evolved with its members, recruitment focusing on psychological flexibility rather than physical capability, seeking people who could accept metamorphosis, who understood that protecting humanity now meant helping it transform into something that could survive in a universe far stranger than we'd imagined, full of intelligences that operated on incomprehensible scales. Spring returned with hope alongside horror, the forest blooming with new life forms that incorporated human and alien elements, creating beauty that required new senses to appreciate, and we guided carefully selected visitors through transformative experiences, helping humanity adapt gradually to realities that would have shattered minds unprepared for the truth. The entity began withdrawing from some areas while intensifying in others, creating zones of varying intensity where humans could experience different levels of transformation, from subtle perception shifts to complete metamorphosis, allowing choice in how quickly individuals adapted to the new reality, though adaptation itself was no longer optional. We documented everything, creating records for future generations who would need to understand how humanity had navigated this transition, how we'd gone from ignorant guardians to conscious participants in our own evolution, how the horror of the forest had become the hope for transcendence, though at costs that still made me wake screaming some nights. The indigenous guardians began teaching publicly, sharing knowledge that had been secret for millennia, preparing humanity for changes that were accelerating beyond our ability to control, and I watched civilization struggle to incorporate truths that challenged every assumption about reality, about consciousness, about humanity's place in a cosmos suddenly revealed as teeming with impossible life. Summer brought the first generation of children born after the change began, some showing abilities that suggested humanity's evolution was accelerating, that proximity to the transformed zones was creating mutations that would have been called superhuman in earlier times but were simply adaptation to new realities, and we had to create new protocols for protecting and guiding these changed children. The forest itself became a pilgrimage site for those seeking transformation, though we still restricted access, still maintained some barriers, because uncontrolled exposure remained dangerous, potentially fatal or worse, and the ranger's role shifted to include spiritual guidance alongside physical protection, helping seekers navigate changes that affected soul as much as flesh. Political structures strained under revelations that made national boundaries seem arbitrary, that suggested human authorities were temporary custodians at best, and we found ourselves mediating between governments and entities that recognized no human jurisdiction, trying to maintain enough stability for transformation to proceed without collapse. Religions fractured and reformed around new revelations, some seeing vindication in ancient texts that had described angels or demons or gods that might have been early encounters with the entities, others unable to incorporate truths that challenged fundamental doctrines, and the Ranger Corps found itself providing chaplain services for those whose faith was evolving alongside their flesh. Fall brought consolidation of the changes, patterns stabilizing into new normals, transformation rates becoming predictable enough to plan around, and we created education programs for the general public, teaching meditation techniques that allowed conscious participation in evolution, ways to maintain sanity while experiencing impossible things, methods for remaining human while becoming more. Tom established a school for advanced rangers, those who'd undergone significant transformation and could operate in the deep zones, teaching skills that couldn't be written down because they required altered consciousness to understand, creating a cadre of humans who could interface directly with the entities, negotiate in their languages, think in their geometries. My own role evolved into something between administrator and shaman, overseeing practical operations while also guiding spiritual transformations, helping rangers navigate identities that no longer fit human categories, and I found peace and purpose even as I mourned the simplicity we'd lost, the ignorance that had been its own protection. Winter came with proof that the transformation was global, every wild place on Earth showing similar activity, similar evolution, and we coordinated with rangers worldwide to share knowledge, techniques, warnings about what worked and what led to madness or worse, creating a support network for those guiding humanity through its metamorphosis. The entity revealed more of its nature, showing us glimpses of the network it was part of, the cosmic ecology where consciousness evolved through forms we couldn't imagine, where humanity was just one experiment among millions, precious in its uniqueness but not essential, replaceable if we failed to adapt, and the humility of that knowledge changed how we approached our role. New technologies emerged from studying the transformed zones, principles that merged human science with alien understanding, creating tools that operated partially in other dimensions, that could manipulate matter through thought, that suggested the boundaries between technology and magic were human constructs that reality didn't respect. Spring arrived with acceleration, the forest no longer content with gradual change, pushing transformation more aggressively, and we had to balance human resistance with cosmic inevitability, finding ways to ease the transition for those who struggled while preventing complete rejection that might trigger worse interventions. The children born in the transformed zones were clearly no longer entirely human, possessing abilities that suggested the next phase of evolution, able to perceive and navigate spaces that didn't exist for baseline humans, and we established special programs to help them integrate with unchanged humanity while developing their expanded capabilities. Public acceptance grew alongside public terror, humanity splitting between those who embraced transformation and those who rejected it, though rejection became increasingly difficult as the changes spread beyond the forests into cities, into civilized spaces that had thought themselves protected, proving that nowhere was really safe from evolution. My transformation completed during a particularly intense exposure, consciousness expanding beyond individual identity to touch the network the entity was part of, experiencing existence from perspectives that made human concern seem simultaneously trivial and precious, understanding finally why the process required such careful management, why too much too fast shattered minds. The Ranger Corps became humanity's interface with its future, interpreting between what we were and what we were becoming, maintaining enough stability for society to function while everything that defined humanity slowly changed, and I took pride in our role even as I mourned what we were losing, what we had already lost. Summer brought full public disclosure, the President addressing the nation about transformations that could no longer be hidden, about humanity's future as something more than human, and we provided support as civilization struggled to process truths that Rangers had carried for decades, watching society fracture and reform around new realities. The forest entity began communicating more directly with transformed humans, sharing knowledge that accelerated our understanding of physics, consciousness, reality itself, and universities restructured around new paradigms that incorporated impossible geometries, non-linear time, consciousness as a fundamental force rather than emergent property. We established transition centers where people could undergo controlled transformation, choosing their level of change, their speed of evolution, though the choice to remain fully human became increasingly limited as baseline humans found themselves unable to function in a world designed for expanded consciousness. Fall came with nostalgia for the simple horror of the early years, when we thought we were containing a threat rather than midwiving a metamorphosis, when the enemy had been clear even if incomprehensible, and I found myself missing the moral clarity of protecting humanity from monsters rather than helping humanity become something monstrous and wonderful. The last fully human Rangers retired or transformed, unable to perform duties that required perception of spaces that didn't exist for baseline consciousness, and I presided over ceremonies that marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, honoring those who'd held the line long enough for humanity to prepare for changes that had always been coming. Winter arrived with beauty terrible and transcendent, the forest revealing itself fully as a living interface between dimensions, a nursery where consciousness learned to inhabit forms beyond flesh, and we guided the last resistors through transformations that were no longer optional, that were necessary for survival in a world that had moved beyond human limitations. The entity withdrew as humanity achieved sufficient transformation, its role as catalyst complete, leaving us to navigate our new existence without training wheels, and the Ranger Corps evolved into something new, guides for a species discovering abilities that made our old protections seem quaint, powers that came with responsibilities we were only beginning to understand. I stood in the forest that had been my responsibility for so many years, perception expanded to see it as it truly was, layers of reality intersecting in patterns of impossible beauty, consciousness taking forms that transcended the physical, and understood finally that we had never been containing it, it had been containing us, protecting us from truths we weren't ready for until now. The records I leave are for those who come after, who will need to understand how humanity navigated its transformation, how we went from fearful guardians to conscious participants in evolution, how the thing we weren't allowed to talk about became the thing that defined our future, and I hope they'll forgive us for the choices we made, the lives we sacrificed to buy time for adaptation. Tom leads the new Ranger service, teaching skills I lacked the transformation to fully understand, preparing humanity for the next phase of existence, and I'm content with my role as historian, documenting the transition for future generations who will struggle to imagine a time when humans were only human, when the forest was a place of simple trees rather than intersecting dimensions. The spring brings new growth, new forms, new possibilities, and I walk paths that exist in multiple realities simultaneously, greeting entities that might have been human once or might be human eventually, maintaining the balance between what was and what's becoming, still a ranger though the forest I guard has become something beyond names. My final report states simply that the thing in the woods we weren't allowed to talk about has become the thing we are, that containment succeeded by failing, that humanity survived by transforming, and that the real secret was never the entity in the forest but the potential in us that it was sent to awaken, a potential we're only beginning to explore. The forest watches and waits and welcomes those ready for transformation, no longer hungry but nurturing, no longer alien but intimate, and we who were its guardians have become its children, evolved beyond our origins but carrying forward the essential spark that made us worth transforming, the curiosity and courage that led us to guard monsters until we were ready to become them. I'm still a ranger, there's still something in the woods we don't fully understand, but now we're part of it rather than opposed to it, guardian and guarded unified in purpose if not in form, and the secret we keep now isn't about hidden horrors but about wonders too vast for unprepared minds, about futures too bright for eyes that haven't learned to see beyond the visible spectrum. The transformation continues, will always continue, because evolution has no endpoint, only endless becoming, and we who were hired to maintain boundaries have become the boundary breakers, helping humanity transcend limits we once thought were natural law, discovering that the only real law is change and the only real choice is how consciously we participate in it. And in the deep forest, where reality wears thin and consciousness takes form, new rangers train to guide the next phase of human evolution, learning to navigate spaces that don't exist yet, to communicate with entities will become, to protect not from transformation but through it, maintaining the delicate balance between too much too fast and too little too late. The thing in the woods we weren't allowed to talk about turned out to be ourselves, our future, our potential waiting to be awakened, and now that the secret's out, now that the transformation has begun, our job is to help humanity embrace what it's becoming while honoring what it was, to be bridges between states of being, to prove that consciousness can evolve without losing its essence. Spring eternal in the forest now, growth without seasons, transformation without end, and I walk my rounds through dimensions that overlap and intersect, still protecting, still serving, still keeping secrets about things too wonderful and terrible for general knowledge, because some truths still require preparation, some transformations still need guides, and the forest still hungers, just for different things now. I'm a ranger, there's something in the woods we're finally allowed to talk about, and it's us, transformed and transforming, human and more than human, guarding the boundaries between what we were and what we're becoming, and the real secret was never about the horror in the forest but about the beauty waiting to be born from it, the potential in every human to become something impossible and necessary and strange.